I am 78 years old now, and before I begin, I want you to understand something clearly. This is not a story about betrayal alone. It is a story about survival, silence, and the moment a woman realizes that obedience will no longer keep her alive. My name is Gertrude Miller, and for most of my life, I was invisible in the most respectable way possible. In 1969, I was 29 years old, married for 10 years, and living in a quiet town in Virginia where nothing ever seemed to change. America was restless then. Wars on television, protests in the streets, but our town lived in polite denial, as if chaos existed only beyond our borders. We waved at neighbors, attended church on Sundays, and trusted the men who wore suits and handled money. My husband, Anthony Miller, was one of those men. He worked as an accountant for the local bank. People admired him. Women smiled at him. Men trusted him. He spoke softly, dressed neatly, and never raised his voice in public. To the town, he was dependable. To me, he was distant but provided everything a wife was expected to want. We had 2 children. Michael, 8 years old, serious and thoughtful, always buried in books. Teresa, 6, joyful and imaginative, drawing pictures on every scrap of paper she could find. I woke up every morning before sunrise to bake bread, pack lunches, and press Anthony's shirts. I cleaned, cooked, sewed dresses for women in town, and ended each day with dinner served promptly at 6. People called me lucky. They had no idea. Anthony traveled regularly, on the first Thursday of every month. When I once asked where he went, he looked at me with a cold expression and said, "You don't need to know everything." I learned quickly that curiosity was not welcome in my marriage. Then came August 17, 1969. The children were spending the day at my mother-in-law's house. Anthony had left early, claiming urgent work at the bank. I was alone, suffering from a migraine so severe it blurred my vision and made the room spin. I remembered that Anthony kept strong medicine in his home office. A room I was never allowed to enter, but one I had seen him use before. That office was his territory. Sacred. Untouchable. But pain can silence fear. I opened the door and stepped inside, overwhelmed by the smell of old books, leather, and his expensive cologne. As I searched the desk drawer for the medicine, dizziness overtook me. I leaned against the bookshelf to steady myself. That's when it happened. A large, leather-bound Bible slipped from the shelf and hit the floor. It opened violently, as if pushed by invisible hands. From between its pages, a folded piece of paper slid out and landed near my feet. I stared at it. I should have ignored it. I knew that instinctively. But something inside me whispered that my life depended on what was written there. With trembling hands, I unfolded the note. Only 7 words. If she discovers the truth, kill her. The handwriting was not Anthony's. I recognized it immediately. It belonged to Edward, the bank manager, Anthony's closest friend. My headache vanished instantly, replaced by something far worse, clarity. My legs weakened, and I had to sit down to avoid collapsing. Who was she? And what truth justified murder? I carefully placed the note back between the Bible's pages, returned everything exactly as it had been, took the medicine, and lay down in the living room as if nothing had happened. But something inside me had shattered permanently. That evening, Anthony returned home smiling. I served dinner. I laughed at his jokes. I listened to the children's stories. On the outside, I was the same obedient wife. Inside, I was already planning how to stay alive. Because from that moment on, I understood one thing clearly. Ignorance was no longer protection. It was danger. At that moment, I didn't know what the truth was. But within days, I would realize that the note wasn't a warning. It was a deadline. From the day I read that note, my life became a performance. Nothing about my routine changed, at least not on the surface. I still woke before dawn, still prepared breakfast, still walked the children to school with a polite smile on my face. Anthony left for work each morning believing I remained the same obedient woman he had always known. But inside, something else had awakened. I stopped listening to his words and started observing his behavior. I watched the way he avoided my eyes when he came home late. I noticed how he locked his desk drawer now, something he had never bothered to do before. When the phone rang, he lowered his voice or stepped outside. Small things, insignificant to anyone else, shouted warnings at me. Living with a man who might want you dead teaches you how to pay attention. 1 week after the Bible incident, I found my first solid clue. I was ironing Anthony's suits, preparing them for one of his monthly trips, when I felt something stiff in the inner pocket of a jacket. At first, I assumed it was a folded receipt or a forgotten note. It was a receipt, but not an ordinary one. It was from a jewelry store in Richmond, the neighboring city. The amount written at the bottom made my hands tremble. It was nearly 3 times what Anthony gave me each month to run the household. The item listed made my breath catch. An engagement ring. Anthony had never bought me jewelry like that. My wedding band was plain gold. Every other piece I owned came from family, or was costume jewelry. That ring was not meant for me. In the same pocket, I found a small card with an address neatly written on it. I memorized it, returned everything exactly where I found it, and continued ironing as if my heart had not just been torn open. I didn't cry. Not yet. Instead, I began creating reasons to travel to Richmond. I needed special fabric. A distant cousin was unwell. Teresa's birthday was approaching. Each excuse sounded harmless, ordinary, believable. On my 3rd visit to Richmond, I stood across the street from the address on the card. The house was beautiful, well kept, surrounded by flowers. Everything our modest home was not. I waited until I saw a woman watering plants next door, and casually asked who lived there. "Oh, that's Marianne," she said warmly. "Such a sweet schoolteacher. She's expecting a baby. Her fiancé comes every Thursday. Poor girl, he works in another town and is dealing with complications with his ex-wife." Thursday, the same day Anthony traveled every month. The words ex-wife echoed in my ears. I was still very much married, yet already spoken of as someone from the past. I returned home feeling hollow but no longer uncertain. My marriage was a lie, carefully maintained for appearances. And I was not just being betrayed. I was being replaced. Over the following days, I expanded my investigation. I befriended Iris, the new secretary at the bank, a lonely widow eager for conversation. Through innocent chatter at church and the market, she unknowingly filled in the gaps. She mentioned a massive transfer scheduled soon. A sum of money larger than anything our town had ever handled. Anthony and the bank manager, Edward, were personally overseeing everything. Late nights. Secret meetings. Suddenly, the pieces aligned. The note. The ring. The pregnant woman. The travel tickets hidden behind routine. This wasn't just an affair. It was an escape plan. One morning, while Anthony was at work and the children were at school, I searched deeper. Hidden inside a hollowed book on the shelf, a book about ethics, ironically, I found a key. That key opened a metal box concealed in the wardrobe. Inside were forged documents, foreign travel tickets, love letters, and a future that did not include me or my children. One letter ended with words that froze my blood. "If your wife interferes, Edward says you know what must be done." I sat on the bedroom floor holding evidence of betrayal, crime, and my possible death. That was the moment I made my second decision. I would not beg. I would not confront. I would not disappear quietly. If Anthony believed I was a foolish woman blind to his plans, I would let him keep believing it, until the very end. Anthony thought he was planning his escape in secret, but he had no idea I was already designing a far more dangerous plan of my own. After discovering the box, fear stopped being loud. Instead, it became sharp and focused. I returned everything exactly as I found it. The letters were folded the same way. The key went back into its hiding place. By the time Anthony came home that evening, there was no trace that I had crossed into his secrets. That night, while he slept beside me, I stared at the ceiling and understood something important. Confrontation would not save me. Men who plan other people's disappearances do not stop when questioned. They accelerate. So I became smaller, at least on the outside. I spoke less. I asked no questions. I laughed when Anthony made jokes and nodded when he spoke about work. I let him believe I was still ignorant, still dependent, still predictable. But behind that obedience, I was building armor. The first thing I needed was independence, even a small amount. In 1969, Women were not encouraged to have their own money. But sewing had always been my quiet skill. I began taking more private orders, collecting payment in cash. I hid the money inside the lining of an old winter coat Anthony never wore. Next, I began documenting everything. I memorized dates. I noted names. I tracked every Thursday he disappeared. I watched Anthony's behavior carefully, especially when Edward visited our house. Their conversations stopped whenever I entered the room. Their laughter was forced. Their glances were calculated. One afternoon, while Anthony showered, I noticed his briefcase resting near the door. He never left it unattended before. My hands trembled as I opened it, knowing time was limited. Inside were transaction papers, drafts of signatures, and a schedule matching the forged travel tickets I had already seen. The transfer was planned for 2 weeks from that day. Immediately after, Anthony would travel one final time, permanently. That meant I had 14 days left. 14 days to survive. Through a client in Richmond, a woman who owned a small textile shop, I learned something valuable. There was an auditor from the capital, Inspector Robert Mendez, temporarily assigned to review irregular banking activity in smaller towns. He had a reputation for being stubborn and impossible to bribe. Anthony despised him. That told me everything I needed to know. I wrote a letter by hand, careful and unemotional. I included names, dates, and hints without revealing my identity. Over several nights, I copied documents when Anthony slept deeply, returning them before dawn. I mailed the package anonymously from a neighboring town. Once the letter was sent, there was no turning back. At home, the atmosphere shifted. Anthony became restless. He snapped at small things. He drank more. Edward visited late at night. Their whispers carried urgency now. One evening, Anthony watched me from across the dinner table, with an unfamiliar expression. Not love. Not anger. Evaluation. For the first time, I wondered if he suspected me. That night, I packed a small bag with essentials and hid it beneath the floorboard near the back door. I taught the children a game. What to do if I ever asked them to leave the house quickly. I framed it as adventure. They laughed, unaware it was preparation. The day before the transfer, Anthony lingered longer than usual, while saying goodbye to the children. He hugged them tightly, almost desperately. When he kissed my forehead, his lips trembled. Guilt had arrived. But guilt does not cancel intention. The next morning, as Anthony left for work, he turned and said, "I may be late tonight." His voice was calm. Too calm. By noon, police cars surrounded the bank. By evening, sirens filled the street. Neighbors whispered. Doors opened. Faces pressed against windows. Anthony was escorted out in handcuffs. Edward followed shortly after. I stood in the doorway holding my children, my face carefully blank, as my husband was exposed not as a respectable banker, but as a criminal. People assumed I was shocked. In truth, I was relieved. But relief did not feel like safety. Because when a man loses everything, he also loses restraint. Anthony was arrested that day. But I knew prison walls don't always stop a man who believes his life was stolen. Anthony's arrest did not bring peace. It brought attention. In a town built on routine and reputation, scandal spreads faster than truth. Within days, everyone knew my husband had been accused of fraud, conspiracy, and planning my disappearance. What they did not know, or chose not to care about, was that I had been a victim long before I became a witness. People began to look at me differently. Some avoided my eyes entirely. Others whispered when I passed. A few offered sympathy, but even that carried suspicion, as if they were wondering how much I had known and how much I had allowed. In their minds, a wife was either ignorant or complicit. There was no third option. The bank froze our accounts immediately. Suddenly, I had no access to money, no income, no safety net. The house, once full of routine, felt hollow and temporary. Bills arrived daily. Friends stopped visiting. Church invitations disappeared. Within 3 weeks, the house was seized by the bank. I packed our belongings quietly, choosing only what the children needed: clothes, school books, family photographs. Everything else was left behind like a life I no longer recognized. On our last night there, I walked through each room, touching the walls, remembering how much of myself I had poured into that place. It had never truly been mine, but leaving still felt like erasing proof that I had existed. We left town before sunrise. In the city, reality was harsher and indifferent. I rented a single room behind a sewing studio, using the small savings I had hidden for years. The children slept on one bed while I worked late into the night, stitching dresses by hand until my fingers cramped. Some nights, exhaustion overwhelmed me. I cried silently, terrified the children would hear. Other nights, I felt something unexpected: pride. I was surviving without Anthony. I was building something without fear. The trial began months later. I was called to testify. Facing Anthony again was harder than I expected. He looked smaller now, older, but his eyes held the same cold calculation. When our gaze met, he did not look apologetic. He looked angry, as if I had stolen something from him. I told the truth calmly. I did not exaggerate. I did not seek revenge. I simply spoke facts. The forged documents, the travel plans, the letter, the threat. The courtroom was silent. Anthony never denied a single charge. His silence spoke louder than confession. He was sentenced to several years in prison. Edward received more. When the verdict was read, people expected me to feel victorious. I felt empty. Victory does not erase damage. It only ends danger. Life in the city was slow and unforgiving, but it was honest. I built a small reputation through my sewing. Women recommended me to friends. Orders increased. I saved carefully, opening an account in my own name for the first time. The children adapted. They learned resilience earlier than they should have. Michael became protective. Teresa became observant. We were healing. Or so I believed. 2 years after Anthony's sentencing, on a rainy afternoon, someone knocked on my door. I wasn't expecting anyone. When I opened it, I saw a woman standing there, soaked and pale, holding a baby wrapped tightly in a blanket. Her eyes were red from crying, and her hands trembled as if she had been standing there for a long time, unsure whether to knock. I recognized her immediately. Marian, the woman Anthony had planned to replace me with. The child began to cry. Marianne spoke softly. "He's gone," she said. "He left us." I didn't know where else to go. For a moment, I felt the past rush back. Anger, humiliation, betrayal. Every instinct told me to close the door. But then I looked at the child. And I saw something Anthony had never planned for. Consequences. I thought Anthony had destroyed only one family. But standing at my door was proof that his damage had multiplied. For several seconds, I stood frozen in the doorway as rainwater pooled at my feet, staring at the woman who represented the deepest betrayal of my marriage. Marianne avoided my eyes, rocking the baby gently as if movement alone might calm both the child and her own shaking nerves. Every painful memory surged forward at once. The lies. The ring. The letters promising a future that erased me. I wanted to shut the door. I wanted to protect the fragile peace I had fought so hard to build. No one would have blamed me for turning her away. Society would have understood, even justified it. But then the baby cried louder, a desperate, exhausted sound that cut through my anger. I stepped aside. "Come in," I said quietly. Marianne collapsed into the chair, as if her body had been holding itself upright by will alone. She told me everything in broken sentences. Anthony had promised marriage after the trial, after things settled. Instead, he vanished. Letters stopped. Money never came. Friends disappeared. Her job had been lost under the weight of scandal. She had finally found my address through an old court document from the trial. "I know you hate me," she whispered. "I deserve that. But I don't know how to survive." I listened without interrupting. Not because I forgave her, but because I recognized desperation when I saw it. It looked exactly like the woman I had been years earlier, trapped by lies she believed because she wanted safety. The baby, Samuel, was Anthony's son. That truth sat between us like a fragile object that could shatter at any moment. I let Marianne stay for one night. That was the only promise I made. One night turned into a week. I gave her small sewing tasks, nothing complicated. Folding fabric. Organizing patterns. She worked silently, grateful, careful not to take up space. My children watched her cautiously at first, especially Michael, who sensed tension without understanding it. Teresa, however, was curious. She asked innocent questions. She held the baby's tiny fingers. She smiled in ways that made something loosen inside my chest. Slowly, the rhythm of the household changed. Not easily, not comfortably, but honestly. Marianne apologized often. I never responded. Apologies do not undo choices. They only acknowledge them. What mattered more was responsibility. She worked. She learned. She stopped asking for pity. One evening, after the children were asleep, Marianne finally spoke the truth that mattered most. He told me you were cruel, she said softly. That you trapped him. That he needed to escape. I laughed then, not with humor but with disbelief. He told me I was nothing, I replied. So perhaps lies were the only language he knew. In that moment, something shifted between us. Not friendship. Not forgiveness. Understanding. Months passed quietly and steadily. The sewing business expanded into a small shop. Marianne proved reliable, talented, and deeply protective of the child. The baby grew stronger. The sound of laughter returned to our rooms. The children adjusted in their own way, learning compassion without being told to forget the past. I set clear boundaries. Marianne would never replace me. Samuel would never replace my children. Each person would stand in truth, not illusion. That was how healing began. Not by pretending nothing happened, but by refusing to let it define our future. Years later, a letter arrived from prison. Anthony wrote once. Only once. He blamed me. He blamed Marianne. He blamed fate. He never mentioned the children. I burned the letter without reading it twice. Some stories do not deserve closure. Life continued. The shop grew. The children thrived. Marianne eventually moved into her own place nearby, but we remained connected through work, routine, and an unspoken agreement to do better than the man who had failed us all. Yet even as peace settled in, I sensed something unfinished. Not revenge. Not anger. But truth. Because silence had protected Anthony for too long. And I was finally strong enough to break it. I thought survival was my final victory. But I soon realized my story still had one purpose left, to be told. I am an old woman now. My hands no longer move as quickly as they once did. And my eyesight now softens the edges of the world. But memory remains sharp. It is strange how time dulls pain but preserves lessons. The older I grow, the more I understand that survival is not the same as living, and silence is not the same as peace. For years after everything ended, I told no one the full truth. Not the neighbors. Not the church. Not even my children. I allowed people to believe simplified versions of my story, because explaining the truth required strength I was still gathering. It was easier to be known as the woman whose husband went to prison, than as the woman who narrowly escaped becoming a secret buried beneath a lie. Life continued quietly. The sewing shop became a stable business. My children grew into capable, thoughtful adults. Michael became an engineer, fascinated by systems and logic, perhaps because chaos had entered his life too early. Teresa pursued art, her creativity shaped by resilience rather than fear. Marianne raised Samuel with honesty. She never lied about his father, but she never glorified him either. Samuel grew up surrounded by women who taught him responsibility, accountability, and kindness. Lessons his father never learned. Anthony died in prison years later. The letter arrived without ceremony, a single page informing me of his passing. I felt nothing dramatic. No relief. No grief. Just finality. Some people imagine death closes wounds. In truth, it simply seals chapters. Years later, when silence no longer felt necessary, I began writing. At first, it was only for myself. I wrote about the note, the box, the choices that saved my life. I wrote about fear, and about how easily society teaches women to confuse obedience with safety. Slowly, those pages turned into a message meant for others. I did not write to accuse. I wrote to warn. Because the most dangerous moments in life do not arrive screaming. They arrive quietly, disguised as routine, comfort, and trust. They arrive when women are taught to doubt their instincts and prioritize harmony over survival. I told my children the full truth when they were grown. Michael listened silently, anger tightening his jaw. Teresa cried, then hugged me as if she were still a child. Both understood something I had hoped for. My silence had never been weakness. It had been strategy. Now, as I sit near the window in the evenings, watching light fade across the street, I reflect on what truly saved me. It wasn't luck. It wasn't courage alone. It was awareness. The moment I chose to see reality rather than deny it, everything changed. If there is anything I want remembered, it is this. Women are not protected by being agreeable. They are protected by being informed. Survival begins the moment you trust your own perception more than the stories you are told. That note, 7 words written by a man who underestimated me, was meant to silence me forever. Instead, it gave me my voice. I lived longer than my fear. I raised children who broke cycles. I built a life that did not require permission. And now, telling this story is my final act of defiance. Because the truth, once spoken, can never be hidden again. The most dangerous lies are not the ones we are told, but the ones we are taught to live with in silence.